The chamber had not been quiet in 2,000 years. Not once, not for a single hour. In 2,000 years of galactic history, the convergence chamber had held the voices of 43 species at the same time, whale song and mandible clicks, and the low subsonic hum of the Dvathi, who communicated through vibrations in the floor. And it had always been full of noise, because 43 species talking at once produces something that is less like conversation and more like weather. Today it was silent. Not the silence of respect. Not the silence before a ceremony. The silence of a room full of people who have run out of things to say and know it. Ambassador Thessalivor of the Kiri stood at the center dais and let the silence sit. She had learned in her 340 years of living that silence does more work than words in rooms like this. She had also learned that sometimes silence is the only honest thing left. She was tall by most species standards, six-limbed, with 4 arms that folded against her torso in a way that looked like she was always holding something back. Her scales were the deep blue of deep water, the kind of blue that has no bottom to it. And her eyes were gold and old. And right now they were looking at the war map projected behind her with the expression of a person watching their house burn from too far away to do anything about it. The map covered the entire back wall of the chamber. It had 3 colors. Red was the breath dominion. Red was everywhere. Red had been growing for 11 years, one system at a time, slow and certain and mathematical, the way a tide comes in. It does not hurry. It does not need to. Gray was the space that had once belonged to convergent species and now belonged to no one. Gray was what happened after the red came and then moved on. Systems that had held populations, cultures, histories stretching back before the convergence existed. Now gray, quiet, empty in a way that empty space is not usually empty. Blue was what was left. A cluster, a shrinking thing, a constellation that everyone in the room could watch in real time, with live feeds from the border systems going smaller, a star going out 1 photon at a time. Thessalivor had looked at the map every day for 4 years. She knew its shape the way she knew the shape of her own hands. She knew exactly where the red had been 6 months ago, and where it was now, and what the difference between those two things meant. She did not look at the map anymore. She looked at the floor. She had brought no speech, no prepared remarks, no diplomatic language that softened the edges of the things she was about to say. She had written 4 speeches and burned them all because they were lies dressed as presentations. And she was 340 years old. And she had decided somewhere in the last 6 months that she was done with dressed-up lies. "We are losing," she said. Her voice carried without effort. The Kathari had evolved in wide-open canyon systems, and their voices were built for distance. Every species in the room heard her clearly. The translation systems embedded in the chamber walls caught it and rendered it in 42 other languages simultaneously. And in every language it landed the same way. Simple, flat, true. "We have tried 7 major offensive campaigns in 4 years," she continued. "We have lost all 7. We have lost 412 warships, 6 deep space stations, and approximately 9 billion people across 19 systems." She paused, not for effect, just to breathe. "The breath dominion has lost none. Not one ship, not one station, not one permanent piece of ground." The chamber did not stir. Every diplomat, every military attaché, every observer present had known these numbers. Knowing them and hearing them said aloud in a silent room were 2 very different experiences. "We have modeled every available strategy. Our best tactical minds, Kathari, Dravothi, Prel, and 17 others, have run the projections together and separately and in combination. The models agree." She finally looked up at the map. "At the current rate of attrition, the breath dominion will reach the core systems in 14 months. At that point, there are no more defensible positions. There is nothing left to hold." A sound went through the room. Not a word, not a protest, something under language, the sound of 43 species understanding something at the same time. Thessalivor had been an ambassador for 200 years. She had brokered treaties and ended wars and navigated disasters that should have broken the convergence. She had stood in this chamber and delivered bad news before, many times, in many forms. She had never felt like this. She turned the feeling over carefully, examined it. She was the kind of person who examined things rather than felt them, because examining was something she could do with skill, and feeling was something that just happened to her without her permission. The feeling was deep and cold and still, like water that has been sitting in the dark so long it has forgotten it was ever warm. She recognized it finally, the way you recognize a word in a language you studied once and almost forgot. The humans would have called it despair. She filed it away, something to look at later. "I am requesting authorization," she said, "to send a formal petition to the human territories, Sol System, Earth." She let that sit for a moment. "We need their fleet reserves. Based on long-range survey data, we estimate the humans have been accumulating warships beyond the outer arm for approximately 60 years. We need 700 capital ships at minimum." The room came back to life then, not explosively, carefully. The way a room comes back to life when everyone has something to say and everyone is trying to figure out if this is the right moment to say it. Ambassador Krall of the Prel, a heavy, slow-moving species whose diplomatic reputation was built on the fact that they never spoke without thinking for a long time first, raised a broad hand. "The humans have never participated in Convergence military operations," he said. "In 400 years of membership, they have sent observers. They have signed treaties. They have never committed ships." "I know," the Salivor said. "They declined every request during the Chitauri conflict, during the Outer Arm crisis, during—" "I know. What makes you believe they will respond now?" The Salivor looked at him. She considered telling him the truth, that she had no particular reason to believe they would respond now, and that she was asking because she had run out of every other option, and that this was what the bottom of the barrel looked like. She said, "Because now we are asking for survival, not assistance. There is a difference." Krall considered this for a long time. Then he sat back down. The vote was not close. When you have nothing left, even a long shot looks like a hand reaching down. The petition took 11 days to reach Earth. It was encoded in 17 languages, transmitted on every frequency the Convergence possessed, wrapped in every diplomatic protocol. The 43 species collectively knew. It was, by every measurable standard, the most formally correct, most respectfully worded, most carefully constructed request for military assistance in galactic history. The Salivor oversaw the composition herself. She spent 3 days on the language. She had old memories of the few times she had dealt with human diplomats, careful, watchful people who said less than they knew and always seemed to be measuring something. And she wanted the document to be something they would respect. The petition explained the war. It explained the losses. It explained the strategic situation in detail that the Convergence's best military analysts had spent weeks organizing. It made the case clearly and completely, and she believed without the particular flavor of desperation that would make any species instinctively pull back. She thought it was good work, the best of her career, maybe. Took 11 days to arrive. The reply took 4 minutes. She was in her office on the station when the communication came through. The office was modest by Kathari standards. She had never been a person who needed impressive rooms, with a wide viewport that looked out over the blue-black of the staging system and the distant shapes of Convergence ships moving in formation. She had a cup of the bitter tea she'd drunk every morning for 200 years. She had a stack of reports she was working through. When the communication alert came, she set down the reports, sat up, and pressed her secondary hands flat against the desk, the way she did when she was bracing for something. She opened it. It was not from the Earth Council, not from the Human Convergence Embassy, not from any of the official diplomatic channels the petition had been directed to. It was from something called the Human Deep Reserve Fleet Command, which she had not known existed until this moment. And it read as follows. Copy that. Sending the Covenant of Salt. She'll be there Thursday. The Salivor read it once. Read it again. Read it a third time in case she had missed something, a second page, an attachment, a footnote, a qualifier of any kind. There was nothing else. She sat very still for a moment. Outside the viewport, the Convergence ships kept moving in their careful patterns. The stars were where they always were. Everything was exactly where it had been 5 minutes ago, and she was sitting in her chair looking at 7 words, 1 ship name, and a day of the week. She put the cup of tea down very carefully. She had sent a petition with 700 ships as the minimum figure. She had written it in 17 languages. She had spent 3 days on the language, the most formally correct, most respectfully worded request for military assistance in galactic history. One ship. Thursday. The Salivore had lived 340 years. She had survived the kind of things that used up most species long before they reached old age. She had maintained diplomatic composure in rooms that were actually on fire. She had negotiated treaties while people were shouting at her. She had once sat across a table from a breath representative. A rare and deeply unpleasant experience, like making eye contact with something that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, and she had not flinched. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. A sound came out of her that surprised her. She recognized it after a moment. It was laughter. Specifically, it was the kind of laughter that is not related to anything being funny. The kind that comes out when something is so far outside the edges of what you expected that your body does not know what else to do with it. It was not a good sound. She pressed her hand over her mouth and stopped it. Then she sat there for a long time, very still, while the stars outside stayed where they were. She called an emergency session of the Convergence Military Council 2 hours later. The council was 5 beings: herself, Fleet Admiral Dross Hanka of the Drevithi, a broad-shouldered being whose species had been fighting wars since before most Convergence members had developed written language, General Sod of the Prel, Commander Yahal of the 3-species Joint Force, and the Convergence's chief strategic analyst, a Kathari named Morith, who had spent 60 years doing nothing but studying the Breath Dominion and looked like it. She showed them the reply. The room went very quiet. Dross Hanka read it 3 times. His jaw moved slightly. He looked up. "One ship," he said. "One ship," the Salivore confirmed. "We asked for 700 at minimum. I am aware of what we asked for." He put the document down on the table with the controlled care of a person who wants to do something much more forceful with it and is choosing not to. "This is an insult," he said. The word came out flat and certain. "They are telling us, through their silence and through this," he touched the document as though it had done something to him personally, "that we are not worth a real answer, that our war is not worth their fleet." The Salivore said nothing. "We should reject it," he continued. "Return the response. Make clear that we sent a formal petition and we deserve a formal answer. One ship is not an answer. One ship is a joke." "It might be," the Salivore said. "It is or it isn't, and we do not understand why yet." She looked at the document again, the 7 words, the ship name, the day of the week stated with the confidence of a person who has already worked out exactly when they will arrive and does not need to explain the math. "The humans have been in the Convergence for 400 years. In 400 years, they have never sent one ship as an answer to anything. They have never sent any ships. The question I am asking myself is why now? And why one?" Morith, who had been very quiet in the corner, spoke for the first time. "Because they've been watching," she said. Everyone looked at her. She had that quality of rarely speaking and then saying something that rearranged the room when she did. 400 years of Convergence membership and no military commitments means 400 years of having access to everything we know. Every battle report, every tactical survey, every study of Breath Fleet behavior that the Convergence has produced. They have been watching. They have been learning. She paused. "We don't know what they learned." The room was quiet again. "The Covenant of Salt arrives Thursday," the Salivore said. "We will find out what they know when they get here." She looked at Dross Hanka. "And we will not reject the response. We cannot afford the luxury of being insulted." He did not argue. Dross Hanka was a military man, and military men who have been losing for 4 years tend to lose the taste for gestures. She went back to her office afterward and stood at the viewport for a long time. The staging area was filling. More Convergence ships moving in from the outer systems, answering the general recall that had gone out 3 weeks ago. Beautiful ships, most of them. The Kathari built beautiful warships, long and elegant, with weapon arrays that unfolded like the petals of something. The Drevithi built heavy ships, brutish and solid, that hit things until the things stopped. The Prel built ships that were complicated inside and plain outside, packed with systems that did 17 things at once. 412 ships lost in 4 years, with the best fleet commanders in the galaxy running the battles. And somewhere beyond the outer arm, the humans had been sitting, watching, building for 60 years. She had been alive for 60 years before she became an ambassador. She remembered what 60 years felt like from the inside. A long time to do something. A long time to keep doing something without telling anyone. Why did they wait until we begged? The question arrived in her head without being invited and sat down like it lived there. She had told Kral in the council session that she was asking for survival rather than assistance, that there was a difference. She had believed that when she said it. She was starting to wonder if the humans had believed it too, and whether that was the reason they had finally answered. And if so, what kind of species watched a war for 60 years and waited for a very specific kind of question before picking up the call? Outside, a new ship appeared at the edge of the staging area, Kathari by the look of it, coming in from the border. She watched it dock. Thursday was 4 days away. She went back to her reports. She poured out the cold tea and made more. She worked. It was what she did when everything else had run out of road. 340 years old. And the one thing that had never failed her was the next task. She would understand Thursday when Thursday came. She just could not shake the feeling. Cold and deep and still, like water that has forgotten it was warm. That when Thursday came, she was going to find out something about the humans that she was not ready to know. Something they had always known about themselves. Something they had been patient enough to wait for the right moment to show. She pushed the feeling down, examined it, filed it away. Outside, the stars held where they were, indifferent and bright, and the blue cluster on the war map kept its careful shrinking shape. And somewhere beyond the outer arm, one ship was already on its way. Thursday came the way Thursdays always do, without ceremony, without warning, without caring what was at stake. The Varith 7 staging grounds sat at the edge of the last defensible choke point in the Convergence's remaining territory, a wide, flat region of space between two dead star systems where there was nothing to hide behind and nowhere to retreat to, which made it excellent for making a stand and terrible for everything else. 50 warships held position there, the finest the Convergence could pull together on short notice, which was not as fine as they would have liked, but it was what there was. They had been in position for 6 days, waiting. The ships were good ships. The crews were trained, experienced, steady. Admiral Dross Henke had positioned them well, layered defensive formations with overlapping firing lines, the kind of formation that a textbook would call solid and a gambler would call buying time. The breath border was 4 light hours away. Everyone could feel it the way you feel a storm on the horizon before it gets there, that particular weight in the air, that particular silence. At 0612 station time on Thursday morning, the long-range sensors picked up a single FTL signature inbound from the direction of the outer arm. One ship. It dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the staging area and held there for exactly 9 seconds, long enough for the Convergence ship's targeting systems to get a complete read on it, then moved toward the station at a steady, unhurried pace, as though it was arriving somewhere it had always meant to be and saw no reason to rush about it. The Salivor was on the command deck of the Kathari flagship Sheer Wind when it came in. She had not slept well. She had been on the command deck since 0400 because she was the kind of person who could not sit in her quarters when something important was about to happen. She had a cup of tea. She was not drinking it. The sensor chief, a young Kathari officer named Prel, who had the kind of face that showed everything he was thinking, pulled up the feed and put it on the main screen. The Salivor looked at the Covenant of Salt. It did not look like a warship. She was not sure what it looked like. It was black. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the standard military gray or the Convergence fleet's deep silver, but black, flat and non-reflective, the kind of black that does not catch light so much as absorb it. It was long, longer than the Sheer Wind by a significant margin, and the Sheer Wind was not a small ship. But where the Sheer Wind and every other ship in the staging area were clearly built to look powerful, weapon ports visible, armor plating prominent, the visual language of threat written into every line, the Covenant was smooth, plain, almost featureless from the outside. There were no visible weapon ports. This either meant it had no weapons, which seemed unlikely given the circumstances, or that the weapons were somewhere the eye was not being invited to look. The Salivor stared at it for a long time. Hull configuration is unlike anything in our database, Prel reported. He was trying to sound professional. He mostly managed it. Engine signature is larger than it should be for a ship this size. Much larger, like the ship is carrying. He checked his readings twice, 3 times. 3 times the power plant a vessel this size would normally require. Why? The Salivore asked. I don't know, he said. I genuinely don't know. The Covenant of Salt docked at the station with the casual ease of a vehicle that had done this 1,000 times. No approach complications, no course corrections. Simply arrived, extended its docking arm, connected, and went still. A hatch opened. 3 humans came out. The Kathari had records on humans, of course. 400 years of Convergence membership produced a lot of records. The Salivore had studied the species the way she studied every species she worked with. Their history, their politics, their conflict patterns, their famous tendency to be difficult to predict. She had met human diplomats before, careful, watchful people, polite in a specific way that felt like a coat they put on rather than something they actually were underneath. The humans who came off the Covenant of Salt were not wearing that coat. Commander Vera Okafor came first. She was in her 40s by human counting, which for a species that lived roughly a century meant she was somewhere past the middle and heading toward the far end, with clear eyes and no particular distress about it. She was dark-skinned, medium height, with the build of someone who was strong in the practical way rather than the impressive way. She walked the way people walk when they have stopped caring what the walk looks like. She was carrying a ceramic mug. The mug was white, with text printed on it in the human-written language. The Salivore would have the translation brought to her later. It read, "World's okayest apocalypse." She did not explain the mug. Behind her came 2 other crew members. A tall man with a long, mild face, who turned out to be Lieutenant Chen, and a shorter woman named Kowalski, who was already looking around the station with the frank curiosity of someone who finds new places interesting rather than intimidating. They both nodded at the Convergence officers waiting to meet them, friendly, easy, as though they had not just arrived at the last defensible position in a losing war in a single ship. The Salivore stepped forward. She made the formal greeting she had been preparing since Tuesday. She spoke about the gravity of the situation, the honor of humanity's response, the hope that their partnership would prove decisive. She had written it that morning, and it was good diplomatic language, warm, careful, appropriate. Okafor listened to all of it politely, patiently. When the Salivore finished, Okafor took a sip from the mug and said, "Great. Can we see the map?" They went to the tactical room. The room was built for this, a wide table, full holographic display, enough space for a dozen officers. Dross Hanka was there. Morith, General Sod, the best military minds the Convergence had put together in one room. The Breath Dominion's fleet disposition came up on the holographic display. 4,200 ships. The number had a particular quality by now. The Convergence officers had been looking at it for weeks, and it had settled into a kind of permanent, heavy presence. Not a number you felt anymore, just a shape of doom that sat in the background of everything, like whether you had given up arguing with. Okafor walked around the table, looked at the display from different angles, sipped from the mug. She did not say anything for 2 full minutes, which was long enough that Dross Hanka's jaw started to tighten. She picked up the display controls, rotated the view, zoomed in on a specific region of the Breath Formation, the central cluster deep within the enemy fleet. These, she said, 17 ships, sitting in a tight cluster near the center of the Breath Formation, surrounded on all sides by the larger fleet. What about them? Dross Hanka asked. Those are the command coordination vessels, Okafor said. She said it the way you say something you have known for a while and are now telling to people who should also know it. The Breath are a hive mind. They do not run distributed command. They can't. A hive mind at this scale needs central coordination to stay coherent in combat. Otherwise, you get signal lag between fleet sections, and the tactical response time falls apart. She circled the 17 ships with one finger. Everything goes through those 17 ships. The other 4,183 vessels are drones. Smart drones built for war, but drones. Cut the 17, and the 4,000 go from a coordinated force to 4,000 separate ships with no tactical consciousness holding them together. The room was very still. Dross Hanka said, "You're saying there are 17 ships?" "I'm saying there are 17 ships," Okafor confirmed. She walked back to her side of the table, picked up the mug again, looked at it for a moment as though she had forgotten something she had meant to think about, then looked up. "So," she said, Thursday. The explosion came from Dross Hanka, and it came in a controlled, quiet voice which was the worst kind. A being who shouts is a being using up energy. A being who speaks quietly while barely moving is a being who has packed the energy somewhere else. One ship cannot reach those 17 vessels, he said. They are at the center of a 4,000 ship formation. You would have to go through every layer of that fleet to get to them. Your ship would be destroyed before it reached the outer ring. Maybe, Okafor said. Not maybe. Certainly. Our tactical teams have run this exact scenario. We have tried to model approaches to the command cluster from every possible angle and formation. The math does not change. There is no path to the center that does not end in destruction before arrival. What math are you using? Okafor asked. What behavioral assumptions are you building the enemy response on? Dross Hanka's jaw was very tight. Standard breath tactical response patterns. The same ones we have observed across 7 engagements. Right, Okafor said. That's the problem. She set the mug down on the table. It was the first time she had put it down since arriving, and it felt somehow significant. Your model assumes the breath will respond the way they have responded in all 7 engagements, and they will right up until they don't. The breath respond based on what they calculate. If you give them something they cannot calculate, they do not respond correctly. She looked at the display. They have never faced a human warship in combat, she said. They have no data on us, no behavior patterns to model, no tactical history to extrapolate from. She was quiet for a moment. We are, from the breath's perspective, an unknown variable. And unknown variables break mathematical models. The room processed this. Thessalivore, standing back, was watching Okafor with the careful attention she gave to things that were either very important or very dangerous, and she had learned over 300 years that those 2 categories overlapped almost completely. She was watching Okafor the way she had watched the war map on the day she presented it to the chamber, looking for the thing under the surface, the thing the numbers were actually saying. Dross Hanka had not finished. He was a fair being in the sense that he tried to be, and he had listened to Okafor's argument, and he could see the logic in it, and he was still furious. 1 ship, he said, and this time it came out with more weight behind it. We sent a petition explaining that we needed 700 ships at minimum. We explained the war. We explained the losses. We have been fighting this enemy for 4 years, and we have lost everything we put in front of them. We asked for 700 ships. He looked at her directly. You sent one. Ambassador Thessalivore spent 3 days on the language of that petition. It was a formal request for military assistance in a survival situation. You answered it in 4 minutes with 1 ship and a day of the week. Okafor met his eyes. She had steady eyes, the kind that do not look away when things get uncomfortable, not out of stubbornness, but out of a kind of settled certainty about where she was standing. Yes, she said simply. That is an insult, he said, whether you intend it or not. I understand why it looks that way. Do you? Because from where I am standing, it looks like humanity decided that our war is not worth a real answer. That 43 species losing 9 billion people and 400 ships is something you can answer in 4 minutes with 1 vessel and a casual message. Okafor was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had the same quality it had been holding all along, level, unhurried, not unkind. I answered in 4 minutes because we already knew what the answer was. We've been watching this war since the first breath incursion. We know the enemy. We know the staging ground. We know what the situation is. She paused. We sent 1 ship because 1 ship is what the situation requires. If I thought you needed 700, I would have sent 700. The room was very quiet. You think 1 ship is enough? Dross Hanka said. I think 1 ship is the right tool, Okafor said. 700 ships in that formation would be 700 targets. The Breath have run the math on large fleet engagements for 400 years. They know exactly how to handle a large fleet. They do not know how to handle us. She picked up the mug again, looked at the display. What you need is not more ships. What you need is something they haven't seen. The silence stretched. Thessalivore, from the back of the room, heard herself say, How long have you been studying them? Okafor looked at her. A long time. How long? A long time, Okafor said again. She did not elaborate. She turned back to the display and began pulling up trajectory models. The Salivore stood very still. A long time said easily, in passing, in the way you mention something that is not a secret because you do not think of it as one. Not an answer, not a real answer. A door left the tiniest amount open and then moved past before anyone could look through it properly. She thought about 60 years. She thought about a fleet being built beyond the outer arm while 43 species bled against an enemy they could not beat. She thought about 4 minutes. She thought about Thursday. She thought about what kind of species builds something for 60 years, watches a war, waits for a very specific kind of question, and then answers it in 4 minutes with 1 ship and a day of the week, and the absolute settled confidence of a person who already knows how it ends. The cold feeling that she had filed away in her office sat back up in her chest. She pushed it down. There was a war to deal with. There was Thursday and the Covenant of Salt, and a cluster of 17 ships sitting at the center of 4,000 enemy vessels. She would understand the rest later. Okafor was pointing at a trajectory on the display and saying something to Dross Hanka about approach vectors. Chun was taking notes on a small device. Kowalski was looking at the display with the frank interest of someone who finds tactical problems genuinely enjoyable. They were going to go into that formation in 1 ship. They were calm about it the way the Salivore was calm in hard rooms. Not because it did not matter, but because the calmness was a tool, a known thing, something practiced until it held when you needed it to. The difference, she realized, was that she used her calmness to manage situations. Okafor's calmness felt like it came from somewhere much further back. Something that had been decided long before this room, this war, this staging ground. Like she had already done the math, and the math had come back fine, and there was simply nothing left to be concerned about. The thought should have been reassuring. It was not quite. Outside the station, the Convergence fleet held its careful formation in the dark, and 4 light hours away, 4,200 breath ships moved toward the last blue thing on the map, slow and certain and mathematical, the way a tide comes in. The Covenant of Salt sat in its dock, waiting for Saturday. As it turned out, Okafor had said Thursday was arrival. She had not said when she planned to move. Lieutenant Navigator Prell of the Kathari vessel Sheerwind was 22 years old, which in Kathari terms meant he was practically a child, and he had volunteered for border duty 3 times because he had been raised on stories of the Convergence and believed in it the way young things believe in things completely, without the complicated texture that age puts on belief. He had been on the Sheerwind for 8 months. He had seen 4 engagements with the Breath. In 3 of them they had run. In 1 they had held briefly before running. He had watched ships he knew get taken apart by enemy fire. And he had learned that the stories he had grown up on were good stories. They were just incomplete. On Saturday morning at 0512 station time, he was at the navigation console when the Covenant of Salt undocked. He watched it on the sensor feed because it was his job to watch what the sensors showed. And what the sensors showed was something he later spent a long time trying to put into words. The Covenant moved away from the station slowly at first. Then it turned toward the Breath Formation, which was visible on long-range sensors now. 4,000 ships in their perfect mathematical formation, for light hours out and closing, and it stopped. Held position. Prell checked the sensors twice. The ship was not accelerating. It was not changing configuration. It was just sitting there, approximately 12,000 kilometers from the station, pointed at the enemy fleet. "What's it doing?" someone behind him asked. He checked the readings again. "I think it's scanning," he said. It sat there for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, scanning, or doing whatever ships do when they hold very still and point themselves at something. Then its engines lit, a signature that made Prell's console produce 2 warning tones he had to manually cancel, and it moved. He had seen ships move fast. He had logged the flight data of every major class in the Convergence fleet. He thought he had a reasonable sense of what fast looked like. The Covenant of Salt was not operating in the same category. It covered the first 100,000 kilometers before he finished the thought that it was accelerating. It did not build speed the way ships build speed, incrementally with the sense of effort behind it. It simply went from still to there, like the space between the 2 points had briefly stopped being real. He stood up from his console. He was not supposed to stand up from his console. It's heading straight into the formation, he said. Navigator, the shift commander said. It's heading straight in, Prell said. He could not stop himself. No flanking approach, no evasive entry pattern. Straight in. The formation is going to see it coming from the moment it crosses the outer sensor range, and it's going. He looked at the trajectory math. His console was running it. Straight in. Navigator, sit down. He sat down. He kept watching. What happened over the next 2 hours was recorded by every sensor on every ship in the Convergence fleet, studied by 9 separate military analysis teams in the 6 months that followed, and never fully explained to Prell's satisfaction or anyone else's. He wrote his account 3 weeks later, when Ambassador Thessalivor's office requested individual crew reports from everyone who had been on sensor duty during the engagement. He was not sure if it would be useful. He wrote it anyway. The Breath outer formation opened fire at approximately the same moment the Covenant crossed their sensor range. This was expected. What was not expected was that the Covenant was not where the fire was going by the time it got there. I want to be precise about this, Prell wrote, because I have replayed the sensor data more than 30 times. The Breath aimed accurately. Their targeting systems are, by every analysis we have done, the best in the known galaxy. They hit what they aim at. In every engagement I have observed, and in every engagement in our tactical database, the Breath hit what they aim at. The Covenant was not there. I do not mean it evaded. I mean it was somewhere else before the fire arrived, as though it had been planning to be somewhere else before the shot was even fired. I ran the timing on this. The Covenant's course change preceded the weapon's discharge by approximately 0.3 seconds. I do not know how this is possible. I have asked 2 people who know more about physics than I do, and they have both told me it should not be. It happened 11 times in the first 40 minutes. Fleet Admiral Dross Hanka of the Drevithi was a being who had spent 30 years in military command. He had earned those 30 years the hard way, in small engagements and large ones. Over that time, he had developed a model of how battles work, built from real experience rather than theory. The model had categories, patterns, known behaviors. He had refined it across hundreds of engagements until it was reliable the way a good tool is reliable. You pick it up and it does what it is supposed to do. He was watching the Covenant of Salt burn through the outer ring of the Breath formation on his command display, and his model was not working. It was not that the ship was fast, though it was faster than anything he had on record. It was not that it was evading effectively, though the evasion patterns were unlike anything in the tactical database. It was something underneath both of those things. The Covenant moved like it knew where it was going, not in the sense of having a target, but in the sense of having a plan that was already complete, and the battle was simply the process of executing it. And the enemy fire was an inconvenience that had been accounted for in advance. He watched it take the first hit. It came from 3 breath vessels coordinating their fire, a layered pattern that his own tactical analysis had identified as the standard response to a fast-moving single target. A good response, the kind of shot that his best evasion pilots would have had a real problem with. The Covenant took the strike on its port side. His sensors screamed. His damage analysis program marked it as a significant hull breach, probability at 63%, propulsion impact possible, weapon systems unknown. The kind of hit that, in any engagement he had commanded, would have been the moment you either broke off or made peace with what was coming next. The Covenant turned around. Not away from the fire, toward the source of it. It went back in, through the outer ring, into the middle formation, toward the fire, toward the densest concentration of enemy ships, which was exactly the opposite direction from every tactical principle he had spent 30 years building. He sat back in his chair. He had seen courage before. He had seen desperation. He had seen the particular kind of reckless choice that beings make when they have decided the outcome does not matter, and the only thing left is the act itself. This was not any of those things. The Covenant went back toward the source of the hit not because it had given up calculating. It went back because, and he did not arrive at this conclusion comfortably or quickly, its calculation had produced that as the correct answer. Aggression as logic. The forward direction as the most tactically sound available option. He sat forward again and began looking very carefully at which breath vessels the Covenant was targeting. They were not the ones closest to it. They were not the ones firing at it. They were 3 specific vessels from the 17-ship command cluster that Okafor had circled on the display 2 days ago. And they were the 3 that sat at the point of the formation that would produce the most disruption to the whole if removed. She already knew, he said out loud, to no one in particular. The officer next to him looked at him. She knew the sequence before she went in. She knew which ones, in which order, and she ran the approach that got her to the first 3 fastest. The hit didn't change the plan. She accounted for it. Sir, how would she? I don't know, he said. He watched the Covenant make the 3 kills clean, fast, surgical. Weapons unfolded from the hull in ways that his sensor chief later told him had given the entire sensor team a moment of existential confusion. Because the hull was reconfiguring, not opening. The ship's exterior was changing shape to present the weapons at exactly the angles required for exactly the shots needed. He watched the breath formation hesitate. He had never seen the breath hesitate. In 30 years, he had never seen a hive mind stop. They did not stop. They calculated and then they acted. And the calculation was fast enough that, from the outside, it looked like instinct. There was never a pause because there was never uncertainty. The math always told them what to do, and they always did it. The math was not telling them what to do. He could see it in the formation, the outer ships slowing their advance, the inner ships adjusting position in ways that were not part of any attack or defense pattern. He recognized small, fractional movements that were the formation-level equivalent of a person shifting their weight, looking for stable ground. The Covenant was still in the middle of them, still moving. Commander Yahel of the Joint Force wrote a much shorter account than Prell's. At 0712, the Covenant had eliminated 9 of the 17 command coordination vessels. The breath formation response had, by this point, become visibly degraded. The outer ring vessels were operating on an approximately 7-second delay between stimulus and response, which does not sound significant until you are in a battle, and 7 seconds is the difference between a shot going where it was aimed and a shot going where the target used to be. At 0741, the Covenant took a second hit. This one was larger. Our damage systems flagged it as critical. I ordered a rescue approach to be planned and then, approximately 4 seconds later, canceled it because the Covenant had already resumed course and speed. I will not pretend I understood this in the moment. I will say that what I observed was a ship that had taken damage our systems considered potentially fatal and responded by going faster. Make of that what you will. It was Morith who was watching the communications data. Everyone else was watching the visual feed, the weapon impacts, the tactical display. Morith had been watching the breath communication patterns, the signals that passed between the command vessels, the coordination traffic that was the nervous system of the hive mind in combat. She had been studying the breath for 60 years. She knew their communication patterns better than anyone in the convergence, better, probably, than anyone alive. She could read the shape of their signals without translating the content, the way you can read the mood of a conversation from tone and rhythm without hearing the words. She watched the communication patterns through the first hour of the engagement. What she saw, over 93 minutes of a battle that should have been over for the Covenant roughly 80 minutes in, was a hive mind unraveling. Not breaking, not panicking. A hive mind cannot panic in the way individual beings panic, but unraveling. She watched the breath's coordination traffic go from the dense, precise, layered thing it always was, like a machine running smooth and purposeful, to something that was running the same processes over and over, faster and faster, producing answers it then appeared to discard and run again. A calculation that keeps arriving at a result that does not make sense will keep recalculating endlessly, hoping the next run produces something usable. The breath were doing this with the Covenant of Salt. They were running the behavioral model of the ship, generating predictions, acting on those predictions, finding the predictions wrong, running the model again, finding the model wrong, running it again. The ship was not behaving in a way any rational model could account for. And the breath's entire tactical system was built on modeling rational behavior, on the mathematical certainty that any species, when the odds crossed a specific threshold, would choose survival over the fight. The Covenant did not cross that threshold. It reached it and kept going. It took damage that moved it past every survival calculus inflection point in the breath model and responded by accelerating. The model broke. Morith watched the breath run it 47 times in 93 minutes. It broke 47 times. She wrote in her account, "I have spent 60 years studying the Breath Dominion. I have studied their biology, their history, their psychology, their tactical doctrine. I believed I understood them as well as a being outside the hive mind can understand a hive mind. I was unprepared for the experience of watching something I understood completely encounter something it could not understand at all. The Breath are not cowards. They are calculators. When the calculation fails, they have nothing to replace it with. The Covenant was not a military problem for them. It was an epistemological one. They could not model it. You cannot defeat something you cannot model. At 0847 station time, the Covenant of Salt eliminated the 14th command vessel. 3 remained. Prel sensors were screaming with damage alerts that applied to the Covenant hull integrity warnings, weapon system faults, propulsion irregularities that should, by every technical standard he could apply, have been catastrophic. He had been keeping a quiet count. He had stopped counting because the numbers had gone past the point where he knew what they meant anymore. He sent a query to Commander Okafor. It was not standard protocol. He was aware it was not standard protocol. He sent it anyway. He asked, as politely as he could manage under the circumstances, whether the Covenant required assistance. The reply came back 11 seconds later. It read, "We're fine." Chun burned his hand. "Kowalski's playing music too loud. We're good." Prel read the message. "Read it again." Saved it. He was not sure why. He just saved it. He went back to his console. The Covenant was moving toward the 15th command vessel. The breath formation around it had slowed to something close to stillness. 4,000 ships arranged in their perfect mathematical formation, and the whole structure had developed the quality of a very complicated machine whose central process had stopped. Still standing, all the parts where they should be, but with nothing moving through them anymore. He thought about the 7-second delay Admiral Drosshanka had noted. He thought about how, in a hive mind, a command delay does not just affect one vessel. It affects all of them. Outside the sheer wind's viewport, far in the distance, a small black ship moved through the middle of 4,000 enemies like it had somewhere specific to be and had simply decided the 4,000 were not a serious obstacle. Chen's hand was burned. Kowalski was playing music. They were fine. Prel sat at his console and felt something move through him that was not quite awe and not quite fear. It was, he would decide later, the peculiar sensation of a young being's understanding of the world quietly and permanently rearranging itself. He had grown up on stories of the convergence. He had believed in it the way young things believe in things. He believed in something slightly different now. He was not sure yet what to call it. He watched the Covenant take down the 15th vessel. Then the 16th. The breath formation had stopped moving entirely. He checked the reading 3 times because a breath formation stopping made no sense. And then he understood, not from the reading, but from the silence in the formation itself, the complete absence of the tactical coordination traffic that Morith had been monitoring all morning, that it was not a tactical maneuver. It was the hive mind running out of answers. It was 4,000 ships waiting for a calculation that was not coming. He had one thought, looking at the display. I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to explain what I saw this morning, and I am not going to manage it. He was right about this. He tried many times, in many forms, and he never quite managed it. Some things refused to be small enough for words. The Breath Dominion did not have a leader. This is a concept that species who have leaders tend to struggle with. The natural instinct is to look for the one, the being at the top, the voice that speaks for the rest, the place where the decision lives. Every species in the convergence had something like this: a council, a monarch, an elected body, a council of elders, some arrangement of designated authority with a chain beneath it. Even species that prided themselves on collective decision-making had, at some point, a place where the decision actually happened. The breath had consensus. 1,100 years of consensus, built through a hive mind that connected every one of their ships and beings into a single vast awareness. Not a democracy, votes imply individuals with preferences, and the breath hive mind did not experience preference the way individual beings did. Not a dictatorship, there was no center of power because the mind was, in a meaningful sense, everywhere at once. A living calculation. A species that had evolved beyond the need for leadership because the mind itself was the leader, always, for everyone, without debate. It had never been wrong. In 1100 years of existence and 400 years of expansion, the breadth consensus had never produced an answer that turned out to be false. It had never led them into a battle they did not win, never given them a strategy that failed, never generated a prediction that the universe then contradicted. Other species looked at the breath's history and called it ruthlessness or hunger or imperial ambition. The breath did not have words for any of those things. They had math. Good math, endlessly refined, that produced correct answers. Expansion was simply the natural result of correct answers. Now the math was broken. The hive mind sat with the broken math for 4 hours after the battle. The Covenant of Salt had eliminated 16 of the 17 command coordination vessels before the engagement ended. The 17th survived, damaged, its communications relays compromised, but functional. Through it, the hive mind experienced what the rest of the formation experienced. The 47 failed model runs, the 7-second delay that had stretched and stretched until it ceased to be a delay and became a gap, a falling, a silence where the coordination signal should have been. The outer ring vessels had received their last clear tactical instruction at 0834. After that, they had been operating on instinct, the instinct of individual ships rather than coordinated fleet action, which was not really instinct at all, just old programs running without purpose. By the time the Covenant took down the 16th command vessel, the formation's effective combat capacity had dropped to something the hive mind's damage models classified as functionally zero. 4,183 vessels, all of them technically intact. None of them able to act in any meaningful, coordinated way. This was a state the breath had never been in. They did not have a category for it. They had categories for damaged formations and regroups and tactical withdrawals, even, at least theoretically, for catastrophic defeat, though that category had never been used. They did not have a category for the math stopped working. For 4 hours, the consensus ran every available analysis. What had the Covenant done differently from every other ship the breath had engaged? It had moved in patterns the predictive models could not anticipate. It had absorbed damage that should have produced retreat and instead produced aggression. It had targeted specific vessels in a sequence that the breath's own tactical system recognized, in retrospect, as optimal, not just for destroying the command cluster, but optimal in a way that took into account every breath defensive response in real time and accounted for each one. Not reacting to the battle. Executing a plan that had included the battle's responses as variables. The consensus ran this analysis and generated a profile. The profile was unlike anything in 400 years of expansion. Every species they had encountered shared a fundamental characteristic. At a certain point, the survival instinct dominated. This was not a flaw. It was simply biology. Beings that were alive wanted to remain alive. When the tactical situation crossed a threshold, the hive mind's models defined as non-survivable, rational actors of every type retreated, regrouped, chose to survive and fight later rather than die now. The breath's entire tactical doctrine was built on this principle. You did not need to destroy an enemy completely. You only needed to make the cost of continuing too high, and rational beings would stop. The Covenant of Salt had not stopped. The consensus ran the behavioral data again, looking for the point where the crew had assessed the situation and chosen to continue fighting despite survival odds that should have produced the opposite choice. Looking for the moment of decision that explained the behavior. Could not find one, because there had not been one. The Covenant had not continued past the survival threshold because of courage, or desperation, or a particularly aggressive commanding officer. It had continued because, and the consensus generated this conclusion with the same careful precision it applied to all conclusions, and then sat with it for a long time because it was a strange conclusion. The crew had not been calculating survival odds at all. They had been calculating mission completion odds. And the two calculations had produced different results. Mission completion was still possible. So they had continued, which meant the survival of the crew in the calculation the Covenant was running was a secondary variable. The consensus had never encountered this. It ran the model a 48th time, incorporating the new understanding of the behavioral profile. It generated new predictions about what a human warship would do in 14 different tactical scenarios. In 12 of the 14 scenarios, the correct prediction was, continue until the mission is complete, regardless of loss. In the remaining 2, the prediction was qualified. There were conditions under which a human force would stop. Those conditions were not losses are too high. They were something else entirely. Something the Breath's vocabulary did not have a precise term for. The closest translation was, the mission itself becomes wrong. Not impossible. Not too costly. Wrong. The consensus ran this profile against its knowledge of human history. For 100 years of Convergence membership, the wars humans had fought before joining, the conflicts in their own history that they had documented extensively in the shared records, looking for the pattern that explained this behavioral model. Found the pattern. The pattern was long, old, and consistent across 8,000 years of recorded human conflict. A species that, in the entire span of its documented warfare, had never once stopped fighting simply because the odds were against it. A species that had fought on from positions of total disadvantage and sometimes won and sometimes lost, and had apparently found both outcomes acceptable, as long as the thing they were fighting for was the right thing. A species that had, on multiple occasions in its own history, chosen to lose rather than win in a way that compromised something they had decided was non-negotiable. The consensus sat with this for a long time. It ran the models again, projected forward. If the war with the Convergence continued, if more human ships were committed, if the behavioral model it had generated was correct, the projection was clear. The Breath could not win this war. Not because the humans had more ships. Not because the humans had better weapons, though their technology was concerning. Because the humans would not stop. And a species that will not stop fighting in defense of something it has decided is worth the cost is not a problem the hive mind's math can solve. You cannot wear down a species that has decided wearing down is acceptable. You cannot make the cost too high for a species that has been paying high costs for 8,000 years and calling it the price of being what they are. The consensus made its decision. It was not a difficult decision. It was the only decision the math supported. The communication request came through at 1:23 station time. Not to the Convergence flagship. Not to Admiral Dross Hanke's command vessel. Not to any of the Convergence channels that had been the standard diplomatic interface for 4 years of war. To the Covenant of Salt. The Salivor was in the tactical room with Dross Hanke and Morith when the communications officer brought the alert. She read it twice, then looked at Morith. Morith looked back at her. Something moved across the old analyst's face that the Salivor had not seen there before. Not surprise, something quieter than that. They went to the Covenant's communication relay together. Okafor was already on the channel. The Salivor observed this and filed it away. The human commander sat at her console with her mug and what appeared to be a slightly singed jacket. The damage the Covenant had taken was visible in the background of the feed. Panels removed, wiring exposed, one section of the rear bulkhead marked clearly by heat and impact. The ship looked like something that had been somewhere serious and come back from it. Okafor herself looked exactly the same as she had on Thursday morning. The breath communication came through the translation system with the flat, layered quality of a voice that was not one voice but many, the hive mind's approximation of individual speech, always slightly off like a perfect imitation of something never actually experienced. "We have assessed the military situation," it said. "We understand your fleet is considerable. We withdraw and request terms." Okafor tilted her head slightly. "Your fleet," she repeated as if testing the phrase. The breath continued. "The vessels you hold in reserve beyond the outer arm. You sent one ship as a test of our response. We failed the test. We do not wish to encounter the rest." The room went very quiet. In the background of the Covenant's feed, faint and tinny, something was playing through speakers somewhere deeper in the ship. Music, loud enough to suggest the person playing it did not know a fleet-wide channel was open. Kowalski. Okafor reached over and muted the shipboard audio. She looked at her screen for a moment, then turned slightly toward Chun, who sat beside her with a bandaged hand and the expression of someone who understood something and was waiting to see what came next. She muted the channel. "Don't correct them," she said. Chen's expression did not change. "Copy that." She unmuted. "We are prepared to negotiate the terms of withdrawal from all occupied convergence systems," the breath said. "We require no concessions beyond non-pursuit to the border. We will not return." Okafor nodded once. "Send those terms to Ambassador Thessalivor and the Convergence Council for formal negotiation." will facilitate a pause on the breath channel. Processing, the breath replied. The channel closed. The Salivore stood behind the console, saying nothing for a moment. She was a being who processed before she spoke, and what she was processing was very large. The breath thought there was a reserve fleet. They had looked at the Covenant of Salt, at the behavioral model they had built of human warfighters, at the 60-year construction effort beyond the outer arm, and they had drawn the only conclusion that made sense to a species built on math. You do not send your worst asset first. You send a test. Probe. Something to see what the enemy does. And if the test succeeds, you send the rest. There was a rest, according to the breath's math. There had to be. And Vera Okafor, in 3 words, had decided not to explain why there wasn't. Don't correct them. The Salivore looked at Okafor on the feed. The human commander had already gone back to work, running diagnostics, cataloging damage, moving on to the next task with the focused calm of someone for whom the last 6 hours had simply been work completed. Commander Okafor, the Salivore said. Okafor looked up. The breath believe you have a reserve fleet. Yes, Okafor said. Do you? Okafor held her gaze. Not evasive. Not guarded. Simply deciding how much to say. Yes, she said. The Salivore paused. And you chose not to deploy it? The Covenant was the right tool, Okafor replied. The same words she had said 2 days ago, now carrying a weight they had not had before. We knew the situation. We knew what it needed. How long have you been building? The Salivore asked. Okafor held her gaze a moment longer than usual. Since before you knew we existed, she said. Then she turned back to her console. Conversation over. Dross Hanka was pacing in the corridor when the Salivore found him. He was a being who paced when he was working through something difficult, and this was difficult. They've been building for 60 years, he said. Yes. While we fought. While we lost ships and stations and systems. While 9 billion people died. Yes. And they said nothing. No. He stopped pacing and looked at her directly. Why? The Salivore considered her answer carefully. I think, she said slowly. They were waiting for us to ask the right question. Dross Hanka frowned. What is the difference between the right question and the wrong one? The wrong question is, can you help us? She said. The right question is, will we survive without it? He processed that in silence. They were testing us, he said. I think, she replied. They were learning about us. She wasn't entirely sure there was a difference. Droshina looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, then at her. The breath fought them for 6 hours, he said. For 1,000 ships against 1. They sent everything they had, and the Covenant absorbed it. 2,000. Yes. And now the breath are afraid of what humanity has in reserve. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. And are they right to be? He asked. Is the reserve real? Is it? He stopped. Is it what the breath think it is? Thesliver thought about the reply that had taken 4 minutes. Copy that. Sending the Covenant of Salt. She'll be there Thursday. She thought about the hull that reconfigured itself. She thought about don't correct them, said in 5 words with the total ease of someone who had already thought about this and already knew it was the right call. She thought about what a species that had been building in the dark for 60 years, watching, learning, waiting for the right question, might have built. I don't know, she said honestly. And I think that is exactly where they want us. Dross Hanka looked at her. All of us, she clarified. The convergence, the breath, everyone. She started walking. Come, we have terms to negotiate. He fell into step beside her. They walked in silence for a moment. Ambassador, he said. Yes. Do you trust them? The Salivore considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She had been turning it over since Thursday morning, since the 4-minute reply, since don't correct them, and 60 years of building in the dark, and since before you knew we existed. I trust that they are exactly what they appear to be, she said. And what is that? She thought about it for another moment. Something that has been planning for a very long time, she said. And something whose plan, as far as I can tell, includes us surviving. She was not entirely sure if that was reassuring. She kept walking behind them down the corridor in the battered hull of the Covenant of Salt. Kowalski's music started up again, louder this time, like she didn't know or didn't care about the fleet-wide channel, or like she knew exactly what she was doing. The Salivor had stopped trying to decide which one it was. 6 months later, the war map was blue. All of it. Every system that had been gray, every border that had been red, every point of light that 43 species had watched go dark over 4 years blue, restored. The Breath Dominion had done what it said it would do in the ceasefire terms. It had pulled back completely, quickly, without incident, with the precise, unornamental efficiency of a species that had made a mathematical decision and was executing it. They did not explain themselves. They did not send a diplomatic mission. They did not ask for anything beyond what they had asked for in the ceasefire. Non-pursuit to the border. They got it. They left. The convergent systems they left behind were damaged, empty, scoured by 4 years of occupation. Rebuilding them would take decades. The beings who had lived in them, the 9 billion accounted for, and the others, the ones who were never accounted for, did not come back. The map was blue, but blue was a color that did not know what had been in the space before it. The Salivor stood in front of it on the day the formal session opened. The same room, the same chamber, the same 43 species in the same seats. She had stood in this room with this map behind her 6 months ago and presented a catastrophe in numbers. Today the map was the other thing, and she found that the other thing was harder to stand in front of than the catastrophe had been. Catastrophe has a shape. You understand. A rescue has things underneath it that you have to look at eventually. Ambassador Dio Amara of the Human Convergence Mission was 60 years old. He was a compact man, the kind of build that reads as ordinary in photographs and capable in person. He had silver at his temples and the hands of someone who had spent decades writing and not much else. And he had a specific quality. The Salivor noticed this the moment he walked in, of a person who has been waiting for a meeting for a very long time and has decided that patience, when you wait long enough, eventually becomes indistinguishable from strength. He sat down at the table where the formal inquiry would be conducted, folded his hands, and looked at the assembled council of the convergence with the expression of a being who was prepared for every question in the room. The Salivor conducted the session. She started at the beginning. Why one ship? Why not 700? Why now? When every prior request had been refused or ignored. She had written these questions out, and they were the obvious ones, the ones everyone in the room needed answered. But they were not the questions she actually wanted to ask. They were the scaffolding. She moved through them carefully, watching Amara answer each one with the same level, unhurried precision. One ship was the right tool for the situation. The breath's coordination structure made a surgical strike more effective than mass engagement. The Covenant was built for this kind of operation. The prior requests had not been refused. They had been assessed and found to be situations in which human military involvement would not produce a significantly better outcome than the Convergence's existing forces. The timing had been a question of readiness. Whose readiness? The Dravathi representative asked. Admiral Droshanka had not come to the formal session. He had sent a deputy. The deputy had his quality of blunt questions. Humanities? Yours? Ours? Amara said. Yours. You were ready before the war started, the deputy said. The long-range survey data places the beginning of your outer arm construction approximately 60 years before the first breath incursion. You were ready before there was a war to be ready for. Yes, Amara said. He said it without qualification or apology. Then whose readiness were you waiting on? Amara looked at the table for a moment. Not evasively. He was the kind of person who looked at things while he was thinking about how to say them, rather than while he was deciding whether to answer. The room went quiet. We have been members of the Convergence for 400 years, Amara continued. In that time we have watched 43 species navigate crises, wars, conflicts, disasters. We have watched how the Convergence behaves under pressure, what it prioritizes, whether it functions as a genuine collective or as a coalition that holds together until holding together becomes too costly. He paused. That is not a simple thing to assess. It takes time. You were evaluating us, said the Prel representative. Not a question. We were learning who you are, Imara said. There is a difference. The Salivore heard the echo of her own words to Dross Hanka. She had said the same distinction 6 months ago in a corridor, still not entirely sure she believed it. She was still not sure she believed it now. And what did you learn? She asked. Imara looked at her. He had that quality of giving his full attention when he turned it on something, the kind of attention that makes you feel slightly like you are being read. We learned that the convergence will hold, he said. Given sufficient pressure, it holds. 43 species, different histories, different biologies, different values, and under 4 years of the worst military campaign in galactic history, you stayed together. You fought badly in some places. You made mistakes, but you stayed together. He paused. That matters more than you might think it does. Why? The Salivore asked. He considered this. Because what comes next requires it, he said. The breath are not the last problem the galaxy will have. They are not even the most difficult one. What comes next will be harder, and it will require the 43 to function as one, rather than as 43 separate species with a shared building. He looked at the map. You can do that now. You couldn't 4 years ago. The room processed this. You let us bleed, the Dravathi deputy said. Yes, Imara said. 9 billion people. Yes. He held the deputy's gaze. He did not look away from it. He did not qualify it or soften it. That is a number I will not diminish. We made a calculated decision that earlier intervention would not save more lives than it cost, and I will not pretend that calculation is comfortable or that everyone in that number would agree with it. The silence that followed had a particular texture, the kind that happens when a room full of people hear something true that they wish were not true. The Salivore had spent 6 months living with the thing under the relief, the cold, deep, still thing. She had examined it every day, turned it over, tried to find the name for it. She had not found the name. She was looking at Imara and thinking that possibly the name didn't matter as much as she had thought. Possibly what mattered was deciding what to do with the feeling rather than what to call it. What are the terms of ongoing partnership? She asked. Back to the questions, back to the work. It was what she did. Imara's hands unfolded on the table. He produced a document, not a short one. We're proposing full military integration, he said. Human ships embedded with convergence fleets, joint tactical command protocols, shared intelligence. Real membership in the operational rather than the nominal sense. He slid the document forward. In return, we need seats at the decision-making level. Not observer seats, actual authority in matters that affect the security of the whole. You want to lead, the Prel representative said. We want to be part of what leads, Imara said. Different things. The Salivore took the document and looked at the first page. The proposals were detailed and specific, and she could see from their structure that they had been written by people who understood the convergence's internal politics with the precision of 400 years of observation. Not demands, carefully calculated offers. The Covenant of Salt, she said. How many of those do you have? Imara looked at her. Commander Okafor's ship, she said. That class. How many? He held her eyes for a moment. Then he said, Enough. She found him after the session in the corridor outside the chamber. He was standing at one of the long viewports, looking out at the space beyond the station. The staging ground had been cleared. The convergence ships redistributed. The formation dissolved. The sense of imminent disaster replaced by the uneasy, textured quiet of a war that had just ended. She stood beside him and looked out. How long did you actually know? She asked. No preamble. She was 340 years old, and she had run out of patience for preamble 6 months ago. Know what specifically? That one ship would be enough. He considered this the kind of consideration that is actually consideration, not buying time. We modeled the battle 9 months before we sent the Covenant, he said. The breath coordination structure had been known to us for about 12 years. We identified the command vessel dependency from their communication traffic patterns. The Covenant is specifically designed for that kind of engagement. We built her for it. You built a ship for a battle that hadn't happened yet. We built a ship for a battle we knew was coming, he said. 12 years is a long time to prepare. Outside, a Kathari patrol vessel moved across the viewport, long and elegant, the kind of ship her people had been building for centuries. Beautiful in its way. She thought about the Covenant's hull reconfiguring itself in the middle of 4,000 enemy ships. What would you have done? She said. If the Covenant hadn't been enough? He was quiet for a moment, a longer moment than he had taken for any answer in the session. Thursday was always plan A, he said. She waited. He did not continue. She turned to look at him. He was looking out at the stars, his profile that of a man who had said exactly what he intended to say and had nothing to add to it. And plan B? She asked. He turned and looked at her then, for the first time since they had come to the corridor. Full attention. The reading look. The session went well, he said. The integration proposals look promising. I think this is the beginning of something that will hold. He was not going to tell her. She understood this without being told. It was not a secret he was keeping from her specifically. It was a door that was simply not open, not because there was anything hostile behind it, but because some things by nature do their best work when they are not looked at directly. The deterrent is the not knowing. The not knowing is the point. She turned back to the window. They stood there for a moment, the oldest ambassador in the Convergence and the human who had been waiting for 60 years for the right moment. Looking at the same stars from slightly different angles, the way people do when they are standing in the same place and seeing different things. For what it's worth, he said. We were not indifferent to what you lost. She believed him. She was not sure why she believed him, given everything, but she did. You weren't the hardest, she said. They aren't. What is? He was quiet again, not avoiding thinking. Looking at the stars the way you look at something you have thought about for a very long time and are still thinking about. I'll tell you when it's closer, he said. He left. She stood at the viewport for a long time after he was gone. The station hummed around her with the sounds of a place that was operational again. Convergence staff moving through corridors, the distant noise of ships docking and undocking, the low frequency of systems running at normal capacity instead of emergency mode, the sounds of the end of something and the beginning of whatever came next. She thought about the Covenant of Salt, still docked at Varith 7 for repairs that were apparently extensive but, according to Commander Okafor's last report, progressing well. She thought about Chen's bandaged hand. She thought about Kowalski's music playing through a fleet-wide communication channel during a breath ceasefire negotiation. She thought about where fine applied to a situation her instruments had classified as anything but. She thought about what it meant that humanity had built their fleet beyond the outer arm where no one could see it. For 60 years watching everything, learning everything, waiting for the exact right question to be asked in the exact right way before picking up the call. She had spent 6 months trying to find the name for the cold, deep, still thing in her chest. The thing that had arrived the day the 4-minute reply came and never entirely left. She found it, standing at the viewport, looking at stars that held where they always were, indifferent and bright. It was not fear. Not exactly. It was a cousin of fear, something that lived in the same neighborhood. It was the feeling of understanding, for the first time in 340 years, that there was something in the galaxy she did not fully understand. Something patient and large and purposeful that had been there all along, watching, and had chosen at a specific and calculated moment to let itself be seen, and had shown her exactly enough. Not too much. Never too much. Exactly enough. She filed it away, studied it, found it interesting in the way you find something interesting when you know you will be thinking about it for the rest of your very long life. Outside, in the dark beyond the viewport, the stars held their positions. Unmoving, patient. They had been burning for billions of years, and they would burn for billions more. And in all that time, they had witnessed everything and explained nothing. And right now they reminded her, in a way she could not have explained to anyone who asked, of humanity. Something that had been there all along. Something that had always known. Something that was not finished yet. The galaxy had spent 400 years assuming it understood who the humans were. It had given them observer seats and treaty memberships and polite, minimal attention. It had asked them for help 3 times across 4 centuries and accepted the quiet refusals and moved on. It had not asked the right question. The right question, when you were desperate enough to mean it, and the breath were 4 light hours away, and there was nothing left between you and extinction except the willingness to say, "Please, we need you. We cannot do this without you." The right question, it turned out, was the one that got a 4-minute reply and a ship named the Covenant of Salt arriving on a Thursday. The breath had been the terror of the galaxy for 400 years. It took considerably less time than that for the galaxy to discover that the species who ended that terror was not the reassuring kind of powerful. It was the other kind, the kind that had been watching since before you knew to look. The kind that sent one ship and meant it.